Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his muddy sleeve, the familiar scent of hay and horse manure filling his nostrils. The Virginia morning was already thick with humidity, and he still had 12 stalls to clean before noon. At 17, he'd been working the Whitmore estate stables for 3 years, ever since his father disappeared and left him with nothing but unpaid debts and a reputation that followed him like a shadow. The sound of expensive leather boots on cobblestone made him look up from his pitchfork. Jonathan Whitmore III strode toward the stables, his pristine Naval Academy uniform gleaming in the early sunlight. Behind him walked 2 other cadets, their faces carrying that particular brand of arrogance that came with old money and older names. "Well, well," Jonathan's voice carried across the stable yard. "Still shoveling shit, stable boy?" Marcus kept working, his jaw tightening. He'd learned long ago that responding only made things worse. The Whitmores owned half the county, and his mother cleaned their mansion just to keep food on their table. One wrong word from him, and both their jobs would vanish faster than morning mist. "I asked you a question, Marcus." Jonathan stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the expensive cologne that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. "Just doing my job, sir," Marcus replied without looking up, his knuckles white around the pitchfork handle. Jonathan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your job? Right. Tell me, stable boy, do you ever wonder what it's like to actually matter? To have people listen when you speak?" One of the other cadets snickered. "Careful, Jonathan, don't confuse the help. He might start thinking he's people." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain still. His mother had taught him that dignity was the one thing they couldn't take away, no matter how hard they tried. "You know what I heard?" Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a mock whisper. "I heard your father didn't just disappear. I heard he ran off because he couldn't stand the shame of raising a son who'd never amount to anything more than a servant." The pitchfork clattered to the ground as Marcus spun around, his composure finally cracking. "Don't you dare talk about my father." "Or what?" Jonathan stepped forward, his chest nearly touching Marcus's. "What exactly are you going to do about it, stable boy?" For a moment, the world narrowed to just the 2 of them. Marcus could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, could taste the copper of barely contained rage on his tongue. Every fiber of his being wanted to show Jonathan Whitmore what the son of a forgotten man was capable of. But then he thought of his mother, of the small apartment above the hardware store that they called home, of how she worked her fingers raw every day just to survive. He stepped back. "That's what I thought," Jonathan said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Come on, boys. The smell in here is making me sick." As they walked away, their laughter echoing off the stable walls, Marcus felt something die inside his chest. Not just pride. He'd lost that long ago. This was something deeper, something that had kept him going through the endless parade of humiliations that defined his life. He picked up the pitchfork and drove it into the hay with more force than necessary, again and again, until his shoulders ached, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. When exhaustion finally claimed him, he leaned against the stall door and closed his eyes. That's when he heard it. At first he thought it was just the wind through the old oak trees that lined the property, but as he listened more carefully, the sound resolved into something else entirely. A low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like music, but not quite, like a voice calling from a great distance. Marcus opened his eyes and looked around the empty stable. The horses stood quietly in their stalls, undisturbed. Even Cricket, the high-strung Arabian that spooked at shadows, seemed perfectly calm. But the sound continued, growing stronger, more insistent. Without fully understanding why, Marcus found himself walking toward the back of the property, past the manicured gardens and toward the old section of the estate that had been abandoned for decades. The Whitmores had bought this land from the government after the war, but they'd never bothered to develop the eastern quarter. Too marshy, they said, too prone to flooding. The thrumming grew stronger as he walked, and with it came something else, a strange tingling in his chest as if his heartbeat was trying to sync with the mysterious rhythm. He pushed through a stand of overgrown honeysuckle and emerged into a clearing he'd never seen before. In the center of the clearing, half buried in decades of silt and vegetation, was something that made absolutely no sense. It was the bow of a ship, not a small boat or a river barge, but a massive naval vessel, its steel hull dark with rust and age. Vines crawled across its surface like green veins, and moss had claimed much of the superstructure, but the basic shape was unmistakable. Somehow, impossibly, there was a warship buried in the Virginia countryside, miles from the nearest navigable water. Marcus approached slowly, his practical mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Ships didn't just appear in the middle of farmland. They especially didn't appear while thrumming with some kind of otherworldly energy that made his bones vibrate in harmony. As he drew closer, he could see more details. The hull was scarred with what looked like battle damage, long gouges in the steel that spoke of weapons and warfare. But strangest of all were the symbols carved into the metal near the waterline. They weren't like any language Marcus had ever seen, flowing and organic, almost alive in their complexity. The thrumming reached a crescendo as he placed his hand on the hull, and suddenly Marcus understood with crystalline clarity that this was what he'd been hearing. The ship was calling to him. Not just making noise, but actually calling, the way a person might call out to a friend across a crowded room. "What are you?" he whispered. The response came not in words, but in images that flooded his mind. He saw battles fought in skies that weren't quite sky, seas that held stars instead of fish. He saw men and women in uniforms he didn't recognize, fighting against odds that no sane person would face. And through it all, he heard that voice again. Not quite human, not quite machine, but something altogether more profound. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vision ended. Marcus found himself on his knees in the damp earth, his hand still pressed against the ancient hull, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You called to me," he said, though he wasn't sure why he was speaking aloud to what was obviously just a derelict ship. "But I'm nobody special, I'm just a stable boy." The words echoed in his mind, but this time they didn't carry the sting of humiliation. Instead, they felt like a question, a challenge even, as if the ship, and he was certain now that it was the ship speaking, was asking whether that's all he intended to be. Marcus stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees, which meant he'd been here for hours, though it felt like minutes. His mother would be wondering where he was, and there were still chores to finish before dark. But as he turned to leave, he heard something that stopped him cold. It was his name, spoken in that same not-quite voice that had shown him visions of impossible wars. Marcus. He turned back toward the ship, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, he could have sworn he saw lights flickering behind what might have been porthole windows. "I'll come back," he promised, though he couldn't say why. "Tomorrow, after my work is done." The thrumming faded to barely audible levels, but it didn't disappear entirely. Marcus realized that it probably never would. Something had awakened here, something that had been waiting far longer than he could imagine, and somehow, impossibly, it had been waiting for him. As he made his way back through the overgrown path toward the stable, Marcus felt the weight of Jonathan Whitmore's words begin to lift from his shoulders. Maybe he was just a stable boy. Maybe he always would be. But stable boys didn't hear voices from buried warships. Stable boys didn't see visions of battles among the stars, which meant that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just a stable boy after all. The questions would come later: how the ship had gotten there, what it wanted, why it had chosen him. For now, it was enough to know that something in the universe had finally called his name. Something that didn't care about his father's reputation or his family's debts or Jonathan Whitmore's cruel laughter. Something that thought Marcus was worth talking to. The questions kept Marcus awake that night. He lay on the narrow cot in the corner of his room, staring at water stains on the ceiling while his mother slept in the bed they'd shared since moving to this cramped apartment 3 years ago. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those strange symbols on the ship's hull, felt the thrumming vibration that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in his chest. By the time dawn broke through their single window, Marcus had made a decision that would have terrified him just 24 hours earlier. He was going back to the ship, and this time he wasn't leaving until he got answers. His mother, Sarah, was already dressed for her morning shift at the Whitmore mansion when he emerged from their tiny bathroom. She looked tired. She always looked tired, but she managed a smile as she handed him a paper bag containing his lunch. "You were restless last night," she said, studying his face with the kind of careful attention that only mothers possessed. "Everything all right?" Marcus almost told her then. The words sat on his tongue, ready to spill out in a rush of impossible explanations about buried warships and mysterious voices. But looking at her worn hands and the worry lines around her eyes, he couldn't bring himself to add another burden to her shoulders. "Just thinking about things," he said instead, which wasn't exactly a lie. Sarah reached up and brushed a piece of hay from his dark hair. He must have missed it during his hasty cleanup the night before. "You're growing up too fast," she murmured. "Sometimes I look at you and see so much of your father it takes my breath away." The mention of his father sent a familiar stab of pain through Marcus's chest. Do you think he'll ever come back? His mother was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting on his cheek. I think, she said finally, that your father loved us very much, and I think that wherever he is, whatever happened to him, he'd want us to keep living, to keep hoping for something better. It wasn't really an answer, but Marcus understood. Hope was a luxury they couldn't afford to examine too closely. It was enough that it existed at all. After his mother left for work, Marcus made his way to the stables with unusual urgency. He completed his morning chores in record time, his movements efficient and purposeful, in a way that would have surprised anyone who knew him. But the truth was, something had changed during his encounter with the ship. The fog of purposelessness that had surrounded him for years had lifted, replaced by a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. By mid-morning, he was pushing through the honeysuckle barrier again, his heart racing with anticipation and fear. The clearing looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, more ordinary. For a moment, Marcus wondered if he'd imagined the entire encounter. Maybe the stress of Jonathan's humiliation had finally snapped something in his mind. Then he saw the ship, and all doubt evaporated. If anything, it looked more impressive in full sunlight. The hull stretched further into the earth than he'd realized, suggesting that most of the vessel remained buried. What he'd taken for battle scars the day before were revealed to be something else entirely. Not damage, but design elements. Flowing patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of view. Marcus approached cautiously, one hand extended toward the hull. The moment his fingers made contact with the metal, the thrumming returned, stronger than before. This time, though, he was ready for it. Instead of fighting the sensation, he let it wash over him, let it sink with his heartbeat until he couldn't tell where he ended, and the ship began. You returned. The voice was clearer now, less like an echo and more like an actual conversation. Marcus found himself responding without hesitation, as if speaking to buried warships was something he'd been doing his entire life. I said I would, but I need to understand what this is, what you are. Images flooded his mind again, but this time they came with context, with understanding that felt like knowledge being downloaded directly into his brain. He saw the ship as it had been, not buried in Virginia soil, but soaring through spaces that existed between dimensions, crewed by beings that were human but more than human. He saw battles fought against entities that defied description, wars waged to protect realities that most people never knew existed. And he saw why it had crashed here, in this quiet corner of the world. The barriers between worlds grew thin, the voice explained. Though explained wasn't quite the right word. It was more like Marcus suddenly knew things he'd never learned. We were damaged in the final engagement. My crew, they did what they had to do to seal the breach, but the cost was greater than any of us anticipated. They died, Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. Not died, transformed. They became part of me, part of the ship itself, so that I could continue to guard this reality even while dormant. Marcus pulled his hand back, stumbling slightly as the connection broke. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a ship, it was a tomb, a monument to sacrifice he couldn't fully comprehend. And somehow, it had chosen him. Why me? He asked aloud. I'm nobody special. I'm just... You are the first to hear us in 70 years, the voice interrupted, and now it seemed to come from multiple sources, as if the entire crew was speaking in unison. The first whose heart resonates with the frequency of duty, of sacrifice, of understanding that some things are worth dying for. I don't understand. You will. The ship fell silent, but Marcus could feel something building in the air around him. A tension like the moment before lightning strikes. Without warning, the symbols on the hull began to glow with soft, blue-white light. The illumination spread along the visible sections of the vessel, revealing details that had been hidden by rust and vegetation. What Marcus saw made his knees weak. The ship was massive, not just a warship, but a dreadnought, a vessel designed for conflicts that dwarfed anything in human history. Weapon emplacements that had been camouflaged by decades of growth now stood revealed, their alien geometries both beautiful and terrifying. And everywhere, etched into every surface, were more of those flowing symbols, now glowing with the same inner light. But it was the figurehead that truly took his breath away. Rising from the bow was a sculpture of a woman, her face serene but determined, her arms outstretched as if embracing the unknown. She looked remarkably like his mother, or perhaps like what his mother might have been if life hadn't worn her down, if hope hadn't become such a scarce commodity. She was our navigator, the voice said softly. Elena. She chose to bind herself to the ship's consciousness so that we could find our way home across dimensions. She has been waiting, as we all have, for someone who could hear us. "What do you want from me?" Marcus whispered. "The barriers are weakening again. We can feel them, the same entities that destroyed our reality, pressing against the walls of this one. Soon they will find ways through, and when they do, your world will face the same fate as ours." The weight of those words settled on Marcus like a physical burden. Alien invasions, interdimensional warfare. These were things from science fiction movies, not from the life of a 17-year-old stable hand from rural Virginia. "You are the bridge," the voice continued. "The first human in this reality to hear our call. Through you we can act again. Through you we can prepare this world for what is coming." "But I don't know anything about fighting," Marcus protested. "I don't know anything about anything. I clean horse stalls for a living. And before today, you had never seen a ship that sails between stars. Yet here you stand, speaking with the dead as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Greatness is not about what you know, Marcus. It is about what you are willing to become." Before Marcus could respond, he heard voices in the distance, human voices getting closer. Panic shot through him as he realized that someone was approaching the clearing. "If they found him here, if they saw the ship, do not fear," the voice said calmly. "They will see only what they expect to see. Old ruins, perhaps. Nothing more. But you must go now. Return tomorrow night when the moon is dark. We have much to prepare and time grows short." The lights along the ship's hull faded instantly, leaving Marcus standing next to what once again appeared to be nothing more than a rust-covered derelict, half buried in decades of debris. The transformation was so complete that he almost doubted his own memories. The voices were getting closer. He could make out at least 3 people, maybe 4. Marcus quickly made his way to the edge of the clearing, using the dense vegetation as cover. Through the gaps in the foliage, he saw Jonathan Whitmore and his academy friends emerging into the open space. "This is it?" one of them asked, sounding disappointed. "This is the big secret you wanted to show us?" Jonathan shrugged, but Marcus could see the uncertainty in his expression. "I heard some of the groundskeepers talking about it. Supposed to be the remains of an old ferry that got washed up here during a flood in the 30s. They walked around the ship, taking pictures with their phones, making jokes about rural decay and government incompetence. None of them seemed to notice the symbols carved into the hull, the weapon emplacements, or anything else that made the vessel extraordinary. To them, it was exactly what it appeared to be, a piece of forgotten junk. But as they prepared to leave, Jonathan paused, his head tilted as if listening to something. For just a moment his expression grew uncertain, almost fearful. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" one of his friends replied. Jonathan shook his head, but Marcus could see that he was unsettled. "Nothing. Let's get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." After they were gone, Marcus remained hidden for several more minutes, his mind racing. The ship had been right. They hadn't seen what was really there. But Jonathan had heard something. Marcus was sure of it, which meant he might not be the only one the ship was calling to. That night, as Marcus lay in bed listening to his mother's soft breathing, he made a decision that would change everything. Whatever the ship needed from him, whatever was coming to threaten his world, he would be ready. He had spent his entire life being powerless, being ignored, being told he didn't matter. But now something greater than himself had called his name, and Marcus intended to answer. If this part also touched your heart, tell me from which place in the world you're listening to this story. Marcus had never believed in fate, but as he crept through the darkness toward the buried warship, he couldn't shake the feeling that every moment of his life had been leading to this night. The new moon hung invisible in the star-filled sky, and the Virginia countryside was shrouded in the kind of deep silence that made every footstep sound like thunder. He'd spent the day in a state of barely controlled anticipation, going through the motions of his stable duties while his mind raced with questions and possibilities. His mother had noticed his distraction at dinner, asking twice if he was feeling well. Marcus had managed to deflect her concerns, but he could see the worry building in her eyes. The last thing he wanted was to add to her burdens, but he was beginning to understand that some secrets were too large to carry alone. The clearing felt different at night. Where daylight had revealed the ship as an impressive but static relic, darkness transformed it into something alive and waiting. As Marcus approached, he could see a faint phosphorescent glow emanating from the symbols carved into the hull, so subtle that anyone not looking for it would miss it entirely. The moment his hand touched the metal, the world exploded into sensation. This time the connection was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus found himself pulled not just into communication with the ship, but into actual union with its consciousness. For a terrifying, exhilarating moment, he was the ship, could feel every rivet and wire, every system both functional and damaged, every ghost of the crew that had given their lives to keep it operational. "Easy," came Elena's voice, distinct now from the others. "You're trying too hard. Let the connection flow naturally." Marcus forced himself to relax, and gradually the overwhelming sensation settled into something more manageable. He could still feel the ship's systems, but now it was like background music rather than a crushing symphony. "That was," he began, then realized he was speaking aloud when he didn't need to. "Intense," Elena finished for him. "You're learning to interface with technology that exists partly outside normal space-time. It takes practice." Interface? The word felt strange in the context of what he was experiencing. "You mean I'm actually connected to the ship's systems?" "More than connected. You're being integrated. The process began the moment you first heard our call, but it accelerates with direct contact. Your neural patterns are adapting to resonate with our frequency. The implications of that hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You're changing me. We're unlocking what was already there," came another voice. Captain Morrison, Marcus somehow knew, though they'd never been introduced. "Humans in your reality possess latent capabilities that remain dormant without the proper catalyst. You're not becoming something different, Marcus. You're becoming what you were always meant to be." Before Marcus could ask what that meant, the ship's systems came online around him. The sensation was indescribable, like suddenly being able to see colors that had never existed, or hearing music in mathematical equations. He could perceive the vessel's defensive screens powering up, could feel the subtle vibrations as dormant engines stirred to life for the first time in decades. But it was the weapons that truly took his breath away. "Energy cannons designed to pierce dimensional barriers," Elena explained, sensing his amazement. "Missile systems that can track targets across multiple realities. And the main gun, well, that's something we hope you'll never need to use." "This is insane," Marcus whispered. "A few days ago, my biggest worry was whether I'd finish my chores on time. Now you're showing me weapons that can destroy realities?" "The entities we fought don't recognize the distinction between combatant and civilian." Captain Morrison's voice carried the weight of terrible experience. "When they breach into a reality, they don't conquer, they consume. Every living thing, every thought, every dream becomes part of their collective hunger. We learned to match their ruthlessness because mercy was a luxury our universes couldn't afford." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "And they're coming here. The barriers that separate dimensions are like a dam under tremendous pressure," Elena said. "For 70 years our presence has helped reinforce the weak points, but we can feel them beginning to crack. Small incursions at first, lost travelers, minor temporal distortions, things that your scientists dismiss as anomalies. But soon," she didn't need to finish. Marcus could see it in the shared memories that flowed between them. Worlds dying in screams of twisted reality. Civilizations reduced to component atoms that fed an endless appetite for existence itself. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Months, perhaps weeks. The exact time frame is impossible to predict, but the signs are accelerating." Marcus closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what he was being told. Save the world. It sounded like the plot of a bad movie, except that he could feel the truth of it thrumming through every fiber of the ship around him. "What do you need me to do?" The question seemed to trigger something, because suddenly the ship's full consciousness focused on him with laser-like intensity. He could feel them evaluating him, testing his resolve, measuring the strength of his character against the requirements of what lay ahead. "First," Captain Morrison said finally, "you need to learn to truly command this vessel. Not just communicate with us, but direct our actions with the authority of a true captain." "But I'm not a captain. I'm not even a sailor. Neither was I." "When this all began," Morrison replied, and Marcus caught flashes of memory. A young engineer thrust into command when his ship's officers fell in the first moments of an impossible war. Leadership isn't about titles or training. It's about being willing to make the hard choices when everyone else is paralyzed by fear. Elena's presence moved closer, and Marcus felt something like warmth wash through the mental connection. "We're going to teach you, Marcus. Everything we learned about dimensional warfare, about commanding a vessel that exists partially outside normal physics, about making the impossible possible when the stakes are absolute. And if I'm not good enough?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. "All right, where do we start?" "With this," Morrison said. and suddenly Marcus felt control of the ship's systems flowing into his consciousness. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, like being handed the keys to a Ferrari when you'd never driven anything more complex than a bicycle. The first lesson was simple: basic power distribution. Marcus learned to direct energy through the ship's systems, to balance the demands of shields, weapons, and life support. It should have been impossibly complex, but somehow his mind adapted to the task with frightening ease. "Good," Elena murmured, as he successfully brought the navigation array online. "You're learning faster than any of us expected." "It doesn't feel like learning," Marcus admitted. "It feels like remembering, because in a way you are. The knowledge was always there, encoded in the quantum structure of your consciousness. We're simply helping you access it." Hours passed like minutes as Marcus worked through increasingly complex exercises. He learned to perceive space-time distortions through the ship's sensors, to calculate firing solutions for targets that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, to navigate the treacherous currents between realities. With each success, he felt himself changing, growing into something larger than the boy who had cleaned horse stalls that morning. But it was the final test that nearly broke him. "Now," Captain Morrison said, "you need to understand what command truly means." Suddenly, Marcus was no longer in the buried ship, but standing on the bridge of a vessel under attack. Around him, the crew fought desperately against an enemy that defied description, beings of pure entropy that sought to unravel the very concept of existence. He could feel the ship taking damage, could hear the screams of crew members as reality warped around them. "Fire all weapons," he heard his own voice command, though he had no memory of speaking. "Captain, the blast will destabilize the dimensional barrier," came a terrified response from the weapons officer. "If we fire, we might take half the sector with us." Marcus felt the weight of the decision crushing down on him. Fire and countless innocents might die. Don't fire, and the enemy would certainly consume everything anyway. There was no good choice, no clean solution, only the terrible mathematics of sacrifice. "Fire," he commanded again, and felt a part of his soul die as the weapons discharged. The vision ended abruptly, leaving Marcus gasping and shaking in the darkness of the Virginia clearing. He could taste copper in his mouth, and realized he'd bitten his tongue hard enough to draw blood. "That was the choice that destroyed our reality." Morrison's voice was heavy with ancient grief. "We saved the sector, but the dimensional barrier collapsed anyway, just more slowly. Everything we loved, everyone we fought to protect, gone." "Why show me that?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you need to understand what leadership means when the stakes are absolute. There will come a time when every choice is wrong, when victory requires sacrifices that no sane person should have to make. And when that moment comes, you'll need the strength to choose anyway." Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing what he'd experienced. Finally, he asked, "Do you think I'm strong enough?" "We wouldn't be here if we didn't believe in you," Elena said gently. "But strength isn't something you have, Marcus. It's something you build, choice by choice, decision by decision, and you don't have to build it alone." As if to emphasize her point, Marcus felt the entire crew's presence surround him. Dozens of souls who had given everything to protect something greater than themselves. They didn't judge him for his youth or inexperience. They simply offered their support, their knowledge, and their unwavering belief that he could become what the situation required. For the first time since this impossible journey began, Marcus felt something approaching confidence. "What's next?" he asked. "Next, we prepare for war," Morrison replied. "And we hope that when the time comes, the boy who was just a stable hand will prove to be exactly the captain we need." What comes next is even stronger. And to not miss the ending, tap the subscribe button now. It's free and you'll be with me in every new story. 3 days after Marcus's first night of true training, the incursions began. He was mucking out the last stall of the morning when the sensation hit him like a physical blow. It started as a wrongness in the air, a subtle distortion that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. But within seconds it had escalated into something far worse. Reality itself seemed to be stuttering, like a broken film reel skipping frames. The horses felt it too. Cricket, usually the most high-strung of the lot, stood perfectly still in his stall, every muscle rigid with terror. The other animals had gone completely silent, their eyes wide and rolling as they pressed themselves against the far walls of their enclosures. "Marcus." Elena's voice cut through the chaos in his mind like a blade through fog. "You need to get to us. Now." He dropped the pitchfork and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs as the wrongness in the air grew stronger with each step. By the time he reached the clearing, the very air seemed to be warping, creating heat shimmer distortions that made his eyes water. The buried warship was no longer trying to hide itself. Every symbol along its hull blazed with brilliant blue-white light, and the air around the vessel crackled with barely contained energy. But it was what Marcus saw beyond the ship that made his blood turn to ice. A tear hung in the air about 50 feet from the vessel's bow, not a tear in fabric or paper, but a literal rip in the structure of reality itself. Through it, Marcus could see, elsewhere, another sky, darker and somehow hungry-looking, where things that might once have been stars writhed and pulsed with malevolent intelligence. And moving through that alien space were shapes that his mind struggled to process, entities that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. First incursion, Captain Morrison's voice was grimly professional. Small one, but they're testing our defenses. Get to the ship. We need you interfaced immediately. Marcus sprinted across the clearing, his vision starting to blur as the dimensional distortion affected his inner ear. He slammed his palm against the ship's hull and felt the familiar rush of connection. But this time it was different. Instead of the gradual integration he'd grown accustomed to, the ship's consciousness pulled him in with desperate urgency. Suddenly he was on the bridge, seeing through sensors that revealed far more than human eyes ever could. The tear in reality was worse than it had appeared from the outside, approximately 3 meters wide and growing steadily, with something massive pressing against it from the other side. The barrier is destabilizing faster than we anticipated. Elena's presence moved beside him, her ghostly form visible now in the command interface. That thing trying to push through? It's a scout probe. If it makes it into this reality, it will begin broadcasting our dimensional coordinates to the main fleet. Then we stop it, Marcus said, and was surprised by the authority in his own voice. The weapon systems are still coming online, Morrison warned. We've been dormant for 70 years. It's going to take time to reach full combat readiness. Through the ship's sensors, Marcus watched in horror as something began to emerge from the tear. It looked like a mechanical squid the size of a city bus, its metallic tentacles writhing with their own internal light. But worse than its appearance was what it did to the space around it. Reality seemed to rot wherever it touched, leaving behind patches of absolute void that hurt to perceive. How long until weapons are online? 2 minutes for energy cannons, 5 for the main systems. Marcus watched the probe push further through the dimensional barrier, its presence making the very air scream in protest. 2 minutes might as well have been 2 hours. At its current rate of emergence, the thing would be fully in his reality within 30 seconds. There is another option, Elena said quietly. You could try to seal the barrier manually. How? The same way we did it when we first crashed here. Channel your consciousness directly into the dimensional matrix and use it to reinforce the barrier. But Marcus, the energy requirements are enormous. It nearly killed Captain Morrison when he did it, and he had the full crew to support him. Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Risk his life trying a technique he'd never attempted, or watch as an alien probe established a beachhead in his reality. When he put it that way, there really wasn't a choice at all. Talk me through it. Focus on the barrier. Morrison's voice was tense but steady. Not the tear itself, but the underlying structure that separates dimensions. You should be able to perceive it through the ship's sensors as a kind of membrane. Marcus extended his consciousness through the ship's systems, pushing his perception beyond the normal range of human senses. At first, he saw nothing different, but gradually, as his mind adapted to the alien perspective, he began to perceive something that existing at the very edge of visibility, a shimmering boundary that surrounded everything, invisible but absolutely essential, the dimensional barrier, and it was damaged. Not just torn, but fundamentally weakened like a piece of fabric that had been stretched beyond its breaking point. The probe's emergence was making it worse, each movement sending new cracks spiderwebbing across the structure of reality itself. Now, Elena guided him. Reach out with your consciousness and touch the barrier. Gently at first, Marcus extended his awareness toward the damaged membrane, and the moment he made contact, agony shot through every nerve in his body. It felt like touching a live electrical wire with his soul, but he forced himself to maintain the connection. Through the pain, he could sense the barrier's structure, could feel the fundamental forces that kept different realities separate and distinct. Good. Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. Now you need to channel energy into it. Not ship's power, your own life force. Use it to strengthen the barrier at the point of weakness. That doesn't sound safe. It isn't, but it's the only way. Marcus took what might be his last breath and opened himself completely to the barrier's needs. The sensation was indescribable, like pouring water from a cup, except the water was his own essence and the cup was the fundamental structure of existence itself. He felt his life force flowing out of him and into the damaged membrane, watched as the cracks began to seal and the tear started to contract. The probe sensed what was happening and fought back with desperate violence. Its tentacles lashed out, striking the barrier from the other side, trying to widen the opening before it could be sealed. Each impact sent shockwaves of pain through Marcus's consciousness, but he held on, continuing to pour his energy into the healing membrane. "You're doing it." Elena's voice was full of amazement. "The barrier is stabilizing," but Marcus could feel himself weakening with each passing second. His vision was starting to tunnel, and his connection to the ship's systems was becoming erratic. He wasn't sure how much longer he could maintain the energy flow. That's when he felt them. The ghostly crew of the buried warship, reaching out to him with their own residual life force. Elena was first, her presence warm and supportive as she added her strength to his. Then Morrison, his military discipline lending structure to the healing process. One by one, the entire crew joined the effort, dozens of souls working in perfect harmony to save a reality they'd never known. The combined force was overwhelming. The barrier didn't just heal, it became stronger than it had ever been, reinforced by the sacrifice of beings who understood the true value of existence. The dimensional tear began to collapse rapidly, and the probe found itself being forced back into its own hellish dimension. But the alien entity wasn't giving up without a fight. In a final, desperate gambit, the probe fired some kind of energy beam directly at Marcus. Even filtered through the ship's systems, the psychic assault hit him like a sledgehammer. He felt his consciousness fragmenting, his sense of self beginning to dissolve under the alien attack. "Hold on," Elena's voice cut through the chaos. "Don't let it break your mind." But Marcus was already falling, his grip on both the barrier and his own identity slipping away. In that moment of crisis, he did something that surprised even himself. Instead of fighting the dissolution, he embraced it. Instead of trying to hold his consciousness together, he let it expand, spreading across the ship's systems and beyond. Suddenly, he wasn't just Marcus anymore. He was the ship, the barrier, the very fabric of space-time itself. He could perceive the probe's attack not as an external threat but as a discordant note in the symphony of existence. And discordant notes, he realized with crystalline clarity, could be corrected. He reached out with his expanded consciousness and simply erased the probe's weapon. Not destroyed it, not deflected it. He edited it out of reality as if it had never existed. The alien entity, robbed of its primary weapon and caught halfway between dimensions, could only writhe helplessly as the barrier contracted around it like a closing fist. Within moments, both the probe and the dimensional tear were gone, leaving behind only a small patch of scorched earth and the lingering scent of ozone. Marcus felt his consciousness snap back into his own body like a rubber band, the impact leaving him gasping and disoriented. He was lying on the ground beside the ship, Elena's ghostly form kneeling beside him with an expression of wonder and concern. That was unprecedented. Morrison's voice carried a note of awe. In all our years of fighting these entities, none of us ever achieved that level of integration with the dimensional matrix. Did we win? Marcus asked weakly. This battle, yes. But Marcus, what you just did, the way you manipulated reality itself, that's not something humans are supposed to be capable of. Marcus struggled to sit up, his head still spinning from the experience. Then what am I? Elena's expression grew thoughtful. We think you might be something new, a bridge between what humanity is and what it needs to become to survive what's coming. Before Marcus could ask what that meant, they all felt it, a tremor in the dimensional barrier, subtle but unmistakable. Somewhere else, in some other weak point between realities, another incursion was beginning. It's starting, Morrison said grimly. The real invasion. That probe was just the beginning. Marcus pulled himself to his feet, still shaky but determined. He'd thought saving the world would be a single dramatic event like in the movies. Instead, it was apparently going to be a war of attrition, fought one reality-threatening crisis at a time. Then we better get ready, he said, and meant it. As he walked back toward the stables, leaving the ship to its vigilant watch, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in him during the battle. He'd touched the very structure of existence and found it responsive to his will. The implications of that were both exhilarating and terrifying. Behind him, the buried warship settled back into its camouflage, once again appearing to be nothing more than a forgotten relic. But Marcus could feel its systems humming with renewed purpose. its crew preparing for the battles to come. The war for reality had officially begun. The changes began the next morning. Marcus woke to find that the world looked different, not visually, but in ways that made his head spin. He could see the electromagnetic fields around electronic devices, could feel the minute gravitational variations caused by passing cars, could sense the quantum fluctuations that danced at the edges of reality. It was like someone had upgraded his senses to perceive frequencies that humans weren't meant to detect. His mother noticed immediately. "Marcus?" Sarah's voice carried a note of worry as she watched him fumble with his coffee cup at breakfast. His hands were shaking slightly, overwhelmed by the sensation of feeling every molecule in the ceramic. "You look pale. Are you coming down with something?" "Just tired," he lied, though exhaustion was the least of his problems. How could he explain that he was seeing the atomic structure of her worried face, that her concern registered as actual waves of emotional energy that made his skin crawl with sympathetic anxiety? Sarah reached across their small table and pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. The contact sent a jolt of sensation through Marcus that made him jerk away involuntarily. For just an instant, he'd felt her life force, the electrical patterns of her thoughts, the rhythm of her heartbeat, the complex biochemical processes that kept her alive. It was beautiful and terrifying and far too intimate for a son to experience with his mother. "Marcus, what's wrong?" Her voice was sharp with alarm now. He forced himself to meet her eyes, fighting against the urge to analyze the pattern of neural firing that created her expression of concern. "I'm fine, Mom. Really. Just had some weird dreams." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus could feel her maternal instincts warring with her respect for his growing independence. Finally, she sighed and gathered her purse for work. "If you're feeling sick, you stay home today. The Whitmores can survive without their horses being perfectly groomed for one morning." After she left, Marcus sat alone in their tiny kitchen, trying to process what was happening to him. The battle with the dimensional probe had changed something fundamental in his neural structure. He could feel it. New pathways forming in his brain. Synapses firing in patterns that no human nervous system was designed to support. "It's called evolutionary acceleration," Elena's voice whispered in his mind, even though he was miles from the ship. The fact that he could hear her at this distance was just another sign of how much he'd changed. "Is this permanent?" he asked aloud, not caring if the neighbors heard him talking to himself. "We don't know. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Your species wasn't supposed to be capable of direct dimensional interface for at least another 1,000 years of natural evolution." Marcus laughed bitterly. "So I'm a freak of nature?" "You're a miracle." Captain Morrison's voice joined the mental conversation. "The first human to successfully bond with transdimensional technology. But Marcus, you need to be careful. Your neural pathways are still adapting. Too much strain could cause permanent damage." As if to emphasize the point, Marcus tried to stand and immediately stumbled as his enhanced senses overloaded him with information about air currents, temperature gradients, and the microscopic vibrations traveling through the floorboards. The world spun around him in a kaleidoscope of sensory data that his brain couldn't properly filter. He made it to the bathroom just in time to throw up. By the time he reached the stables an hour later, Marcus had learned to keep his enhanced perceptions partially suppressed. It was like squinting with his entire nervous system, but it allowed him to function without being overwhelmed by sensory input. The horses, however, seemed to sense that something was different about him. They stood quietly in their stalls, watching him with what looked almost like respect. He was mucking out Cricket's stall when Jonathan Whitmore appeared in the stable doorway, flanked by his usual entourage of Academy friends. But today was different. Today Marcus could see the bioelectric aura that surrounded each of them, could sense their emotional states as clearly as if they were written on placards. Jonathan was afraid. "Well, well," Jonathan's voice carried its usual arrogant drawl, but Marcus could see the uncertainty beneath the bravado. "If it isn't our local stable genius." Marcus continued working, though every instinct screamed at him to turn around. His enhanced senses were picking up something else from Jonathan, a resonance, faint but unmistakable, that felt similar to his own connection with the buried warship. "He's been touched by something," Elena's voice whispered urgently in his mind. "Something from their dimension." The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The probe he'd destroyed hadn't been the only incursion. Somewhere, somehow, the entities had made contact with Jonathan. The question was whether it had been intentional or accidental. "I'm talking to you, stable boy." Jonathan stepped closer, and Marcus could smell something wrong about him. Not just expensive cologne and privilege, but something that made his enhanced senses recoil in revulsion. Marcus turned around slowly, keeping his expression carefully neutral while his mind raced. "Can I help you with something, Mr. Whitmore?" Jonathan's eyes narrowed, and for just a moment Marcus saw something else looking out through them. Something alien and hungry. "You've been acting strange lately. People have been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that could get you fired." Jonathan's voice dropped to a whisper, but Marcus could hear the threat clearly. "The kind that could get your mother fired too." Marcus felt anger surge through him, and with it came a sudden, terrifying awareness of his own power. He could feel the dimensional barriers all around them, could sense how easy it would be to reach out and adjust things. Make Jonathan forget this conversation. Make him forget Marcus existed entirely. Hell, make him forget how to breathe. The thought scared him so badly that he took an involuntary step backward. "Don't." Morrison's voice cut through the dark impulse like a blade. "That path leads to becoming the very thing we fought against." "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said carefully, forcing his voice to remain steady. Jonathan smiled, but it was the kind of expression that belonged on something with too many teeth. "Oh, I think you do. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, just like I know what you've been doing in that old clearing." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water. "What clearing?" "The one with the old wreck. The one that's been making very interesting noises lately." Jonathan leaned closer, and Marcus could see flecks of something that wasn't quite human in his eyes. "The one that talks." Before Marcus could respond, one of Jonathan's friends, a stocky boy named Richards, shifted uncomfortably. "Johnny, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Jonathan snapped, never taking his eyes off Marcus. "This doesn't concern you." But Marcus could see that it did concern Richards. The other boy's aura showed confusion, fear, and something that looked like resistance. Whatever had gotten to Jonathan hadn't fully claimed him yet, and his friends were starting to notice the changes. "This is worse than we thought." Elena's voice was tight with worry. "If the entity is using Jonathan as a vector, it could spread to others through close contact." "You don't look so good, stable boy," Jonathan continued, his voice taking on an odd sing-song quality. "Having trouble sleeping? Seeing things that shouldn't be there? Hearing voices?" Each question hit uncomfortably close to home, and Marcus realized that whatever was speaking through Jonathan knew about his connection to the ship, which meant the entities were learning, adapting, preparing for a more sophisticated assault. "I think you should leave," Marcus said quietly. Jonathan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Or what? What exactly are you going to do about it, stable boy?" The challenge hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond teenage posturing. Marcus could feel the dimensional barriers trembling around them, responding to the conflict. One wrong move, one moment of lost control, and he could tear a hole in reality right here in the stable. But that's exactly what the entity wanted, he realized. It was trying to provoke him into using his powers, into creating another incursion point that it could exploit. Instead, Marcus did something that clearly surprised both Jonathan and the thing riding inside his consciousness. He smiled. "I'm going to finish my work," Marcus said calmly. "And you're going to go back to your privileged life and pretend this conversation never happened. Because if it did happen, that would mean you've been talking to the help, and that would be embarrassing for someone of your status." For just a moment, Jonathan looked genuinely confused, as if two different personalities were fighting for control of his responses. Then his expression hardened into something that was purely alien. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "No," Marcus agreed quietly. "I don't think it is." After Jonathan and his friends left, Marcus stood alone in the stable, his hands shaking with the aftermath of the encounter. He'd managed to avoid a direct confrontation, but at what cost? The entity now knew that he was aware of its presence. Worse, it knew that he was connected to the buried warship. "You did the right thing," Morrison's voice was approving. "Fighting it in a populated area would have been catastrophic, but now it knows about us. It was going to find out eventually. The question is what we do about it." Marcus looked around the stable, at the horses that had been his constant companions for the past 3 years. In a few hours, his mother would come home from work, tired but smiling, ready to share whatever small triumphs and defeats had filled her day. This was his world. Small, modest, but precious beyond measure. And something from the space between realities wanted to destroy it all. "We fight," Marcus said, surprised by the steel in his own voice. "Whatever it takes, however dangerous it gets, we fight. Even if it means risking everything you care about?" Marcus thought about his mother's worried face that morning, about the horses that trusted him, about all the ordinary people who had no idea that their reality hung by a thread. Especially then, he said. As he walked home that evening, Marcus could feel the dimensional barriers shifting around him like tidal forces. The real war was coming, and when it arrived, it would be fought not just for the fate of his world but for his own soul. The question was whether the boy who had once been just a stable hand would prove strong enough to win it. If you're feeling the tension building like I am, let me know from which corner of the world you're following Marcus's incredible journey. The end began at 3:17 a.m. with the sound of reality screaming. Marcus jolted awake in his narrow bed as dimensional alarms that only he could hear shrieked through his enhanced consciousness. Outside their apartment window, the Virginia night flickered like a broken television signal, showing glimpses of alien skies where familiar stars should have been. Marcus. Elena's voice cut through the chaos with desperate urgency. Multiple breaches opening simultaneously. This is it. The full invasion. He rolled out of bed and grabbed his clothes, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. His mother stirred in the main bed, mumbling something about the strange lights outside, but didn't fully wake. Marcus pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, knowing it might be the last time he saw her. "Stay safe, Mom," he whispered, then slipped out into the night. The world had gone insane. Tears and reality dotted the landscape like malevolent stars, each one disgorging horrors that his mind struggled to process. Through his enhanced perception, Marcus could see the dimensional barriers collapsing in a cascade failure that stretched for miles in every direction. The entities weren't just invading, they were unraveling the very fabric of his reality, preparing to consume it from the inside out. But the largest breach, the one that made his soul ache just to perceive, was directly above the Whitmore estate. Marcus ran through streets where physics had become optional, dodging patches of space where gravity flowed sideways and time moved in stuttering loops. Cars sat abandoned as their drivers fled from phenomena that violated every law of nature they'd ever learned. In the distance, he could hear screams, human voices raised in terror as they encountered things that should not exist. The buried warship was fully revealed when he reached the clearing, its massive bulk rising from the earth like a technological mountain. Every surface blazed with defensive energy, and the air around it crackled with weapons fire as the ghostly crew fought to hold back the tide of invasion. About time, Morrison's voice was grim as Marcus slammed his palm against the hull. "We're holding the line, but barely. The main breach is using Jonathan Whitmore as an anchor point. As long as he remains compromised, they can keep reinforcing their position." The neural interface was instantaneous now, pulling Marcus directly onto the ship's bridge without the gradual integration he'd grown accustomed to. Around him, the crew's ghostly forms moved with military precision, each one focused on their assigned tasks with the kind of desperate efficiency that came from fighting an unwinnable war. Through the ship's sensors, Marcus could see the true scope of the disaster. Hundreds of entities poured through dimensional tiers across the county, each one a nightmare of impossible geometry and malevolent intelligence. But it was the massive form emerging from the breach above the estate that truly terrified him. Something so large and wrong that looking at it directly caused his enhanced vision to blur and static. The harvester, Elena's presence moved beside him, her ghostly hand resting on his shoulder. A full-scale reality devourer. If it completes its manifestation, it will begin consuming this entire dimension. How long do we have? Minutes, maybe less. Marcus felt the weight of absolute responsibility settle on his shoulders. Every person in his world, his mother, the horses in the stable, the millions of innocent people who had no idea their existence was under threat, all of them depended on what he did in the next few minutes. "All weapons, target the harvester," he commanded, and was surprised by how natural the authority felt in his voice. "Energy cannons firing," came the weapons officer's response, and Marcus felt the ship shudder as its massive guns discharged. The beams struck the partially manifested entity, causing it to writhe and partially retreat back through the dimensional barrier. But the damage was temporary. Already the creature was pushing forward again, using Jonathan as a psychic anchor to maintain its foothold in reality. Direct assault won't work. Morrison's tactical analysis was coldly professional. As long as the anchor point remains stable, the entity can regenerate faster than we can damage it. Marcus closed his eyes and extended his consciousness through the ship's sensors, searching for alternatives. That's when he saw him, Jonathan Whitmore, standing in the garden of his family's estate, his arms raised toward the breach above, his voice raised in words that hurt to hear. Around him, His academy friends stood in perfect circles, their faces blank and their eyes reflecting the alien light that poured through the dimensional tiers. But Richards, the stocky boy who had shown resistance during their encounter in the stable, was fighting back. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out in his bioelectric aura, the human personality battling against the alien influence that sought to claim him. There, Marcus realized with sudden clarity, Richards is the weak link. If I can break him free, it might destabilize their entire network. How do you propose to reach him? Elena asked. The estate is crawling with manifested entities. Marcus studied the tactical display, calculating distances and probabilities with a strategic mind he hadn't possessed just weeks ago. I don't go to him. I bring him here. Before anyone could ask what he meant, Marcus reached out with his consciousness and did something that should have been impossible. He grabbed Richard's awareness directly, using the boy's resistance as a handhold, and pulled his entire conscious mind across 3 miles of space into the ship's neural network. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. Richards's consciousness materialized on the bridge as a confused, terrified presence that looked around with wide, disbelieving eyes. What? Where am I? Richards's voice echoed strangely in the mental space. Somewhere safe, Marcus replied, though he could feel the strain of maintaining the connection across such distance. Richards, listen to me. You're being controlled by something that wants to destroy everything you've ever cared about. Your friends, your family, your entire world. I can feel it. Richard's ghostly form was shaking. In my head. It's been growing stronger, making me think things that aren't me. The entity is fighting back, Elena warned. It's trying to reclaim him through the connection. Marcus could see it too. Tendrils of alien consciousness reaching across the dimensional barriers, seeking to drag Richards back into their collective influence. But the boy was fighting with everything he had, and his resistance was creating chaos in their carefully orchestrated invasion. Through the ship's sensors, Marcus watched as the circle of controlled academy students began to waver. Without Richards to complete their formation, the psychic anchor that held the main breach stable was beginning to fluctuate. Now's our chance, Morrison said urgently, but we need to hit the harvester with everything we have while it's vulnerable. All weapons, maximum power, Marcus commanded. Pour everything into that thing. The ship's guns fired in perfect synchronization, sending beams of concentrated dimensional energy into the partially manifested horror above the estate. This time, the damage stuck. The harvester's form began to collapse inward, its reality-warping presence destabilizing as its anchor point wavered. But the entity had one last, desperate gambit. Instead of retreating, it began to cannibalize the smaller breaches, pulling energy from across the county to fuel one final, massive manifestation. The process was violently destructive. Reality tears collapsed like popping bubbles, their stored energy feeding into the primary breach until it blazed like a malevolent star. It's going to overload. Elena's voice was tight with alarm. If that much dimensional energy releases at once, it will create a cascade failure that destroys this entire region. Marcus saw the choice with perfect clarity. He could maintain the weapons barrage, hoping to destroy the harvester before it completed its final manifestation. Or he could do something that terrified him more than facing alien horrors. He could open himself completely to the dimensional matrix and try to contain the energy release manually. The first option might work, but if it failed, millions would die. The second option would almost certainly kill him, but it might save everyone else. You don't have to do this alone. Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. We're with you, whatever you choose. Marcus felt the entire ghostly crew surrounding him with their presence, offering not just their knowledge and experience, but the last remnants of their existence itself. They were prepared to sacrifice everything, again, to protect a reality they'd never known. If we do this, Marcus said quietly, there's no going back, for any of us. There never was, Elena replied. From the moment you first heard our call, this was always where we were heading. Marcus nodded and reached out with his consciousness, not toward the ship's weapons, but toward the very foundation of reality itself. He felt the dimensional barriers respond to his will, felt the incredible energies that held existence together flowing through his awareness like liquid fire. As the harvester completed its final manifestation and prepared to devour his world, Marcus made the choice that transformed him from a boy who had once cleaned horse stalls into something far greater and more terrible. He became the barrier itself, spreading his consciousness across the dimensional matrix to contain the explosion that would otherwise destroy everything he loved. The pain was indescribable. Every atom of his being felt like it was being torn apart and reassembled in patterns that human biology was never meant to survive. But through it all, he held on, using his will and the sacrifice of the ship's crew to contain energies that could have powered stars. When it was over, when the last of the invading entities had been forced back into their own hellish dimension and the barriers had been sealed stronger than ever before, Marcus found himself changed once again. He existed now partially outside normal space-time, connected to the dimensional matrix in ways that would let him guard against future incursions. He was no longer fully human, but he was still Marcus, still the boy who had chosen to protect others rather than himself, who had found the strength to become what the situation required. Standing in his transformed reality, looking out over a world that would never again be threatened by entities from beyond the barriers of existence, Marcus finally understood what Elena had meant when she'd called him a miracle. He hadn't just saved his world, he'd become its eternal guardian. And in a small apartment above the hardware store, his mother woke from dreams of strange lights and whispered a prayer of gratitude for her son, never knowing that he had just given everything to keep her safe. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, tap the red button that says subscribe. It's free and it helps me keep sharing these incredible journeys with all of you, no matter where in the world you're watching from.